Do you own an Audi R8 or a Lamborghini V10 that wants to know more about carbon cleaning? Hi, I'm OJ, and I'm with Fluid MotorUnion in Naperville. And today we're talking about why your gasoline direct injection V10 could benefit from regular factory recommended cleanings, and how our three-step process is better than this industry standard walnut shell blasting alone. 2011 Audi R8 V10. Customers requesting a carbon clean, and the reason why that's important is because these motors are direct injection. Direct injection is great for having the fuel injector inside of the cylinder, cooling the piston, getting more performance from the engine. The big problem that they found switching to that technology around that time was the fuel was no longer cleaning the valve while it was being sprayed in. That left the valve open to having oil build up, coking carbon buildup. That carbon buildup eventually starts degrading the airflow. It can reduce performance, amongst other things. Because of that, it needs to be regularly maintained in order to keep the car running in peak condition. So what we're going to be doing here is removing the intake manifold, assessing how the valves look, and then performing a carbon clean, most likely using a few methods, one of them being walnut shell blasting, as well as a chemical clean to kind of finish off some of the more sooty, harder deposits. So we're going to be following Michael, and we'll be seeing what's involved, what's going on to get this done.
First things first is we're going to have to get the engine covers off. Now, in a lot of exotics and supercars, there's always a few engine covers to make everything look nice and worth the money that you pay for it, and have it hide all of the hoses and ugliness that don't look so aesthetic. The airbox needs to come out in order for us to access some of the bolts underneath the intake manifold. So what you're going to see here is us getting the covers off, splitting the airbox, and then we're going to go ahead and remove all of the components of the air ducting, hoses, clamps, connectors, and that's just going to allow us to get at those front bolts. Once we have those items removed, we're going to be able to see what we need to release. Good lighting is always important.
How do you work on this car?
The intake manifold isn't just the bolts, it's also all of the vacuum tubes that go onto it, so extra care is going to be needed to get those things off. Removing the throttle bodies allows us a little bit more access to the bolts directly below it. And with all of the obstructions out of the way, we can go ahead and start releasing those intake manifold bolts. And with all the bolts released, we can remove the intake manifold from the vehicle. We're still not quite there. We're going to have to remove these intake runner flaps in order to see down into the valve and see how bad the corrosion is. And the fuel rails are going to have to be removed in order for us to release the lower intake manifold flaps. What we're not showing here was us releasing the fuel pressure before we even got to this step, because anytime you're dealing with a high pressure fuel system, there's always the possibility pressure's left in the rails. And if that comes out, the pressure that it's actually at can go into your skin and cause a potentially fatal situation. So a lot of care has to be taken when dealing with the high pressure fuel system, including releasing the pressure before you ever touch any of the components on the high pressure rail. Removing the intake manifold rudder flaps is going to allow us to see down into the valve, but we're still not done yet. Inside of each one of the intake runners is a swirl flap, and those have to be removed. Oftentimes those are pretty carboned up. Now these cars can be tricky to turn over by hand in order for us to make sure the valve is shut. So we're going to go ahead and hook the battery back up so that way we can bump it over to where we want. And with the battery hooked up, this ensures that the valves we want to work on are closed. And believe it or not, this is pretty typical for a car with 40,000 miles. We've seen them worse, we've seen them in better shape, but this is how you can expect them to look with that sort of mileage.
All right, so the manifold's off and we've got a view at the valves. What you can see is basically a mixture of oil vapors from the crankcase that are recycled, meaning to be reburnt for emissions issues. Those tend up sticking to the valve because the valves are hot, and over time that accumulates to build up to what you're seeing there, which is carbon, but it's basically an oil mixture of leftovers in the engine that end up on the valve and kind of coke up there and sit there. So like I said, that disturbs airflow. There's a few ways that go about cleaning this. A lot of people use the walnut shell, which is basically crushed walnut shells blasted at a high pressure, and that'll break up the carbon, kind of clean the area. but it really depends on how the carbon's setting in there. Sometimes it's very oily, sometimes it's sooty, dry, and a one-step approach isn't always the best. Sometimes you might even have to take a three-step approach, using a media to blast it off, like walnut shells, using a chemical to soak it and clean it off, and then maybe using a brush to finish it off. We like to get them as clean as possible, only because that extends the amount of time before it builds up again. So if it's fresh like factory, and the surfaces are like the factory, hopefully have about as much time as the car originally had to build up on. Now, because of wear of like engine rings and things like that, that won't be the case, but that's best guess, best wishes, best thinking. So we're gonna go ahead and clean these off and show you what we do to get valves clean, which is probably a few steps above your typical walnut shell blasting.
Our three-step process involves media blasting, a chemical cleaning, and an agitation process. Here you'll see some of the equipment we use to do the media blasting, and those are the walnut shells that we use. We're taping up some of the injectors to make sure none of the excess walnut gets in any of the connectors, the connections, the fuel. Walnut shells by itself work really well on dry, sooty carbon. But for sludgy and gummy carbon, kind of like what we're seeing here, you need to sort of break it up first before you go ahead and straight blast it, allowing the media to not stick to the gummy deposits and break it up a little bit easier. And with everything nice and loosened up, we can go ahead and start the walnut shell media blasting. Here, high pressure air is forcing walnut shells down onto the valve in order to strip away some of the gummy carbon deposits, and that is then picked up by the vacuum. Here we're going to pour down some cleaner, allow it to soak while we work on the rest of the cylinders, and that cleaner is going to strip away any of the other deposits that are left that the walnut shell blasting couldn't. And we repeat this process as many times as we feel necessary in order to get the runner as clean as we think it could be. Doing it this way is not as book hour friendly as possible, but it is more thorough, and we do believe it allows more time for accumulation before you have to do this process again. And with that, we can put the intake manifold back on and get everything back to how it was. And in order to check that we've got everything hooked up correctly, we're going to go ahead and start the vehicle, make sure there's no running issues, get the oil up to temperature, and then do the oil change. Once we have everything bolted up, we're going to go ahead and change the oil. Possibly some of the cleaner we use can seep past the valves, and we want to get that all out of the engine sump so that way it's not circulating in the oil. So fresh oil is always a requirement when we do a valve cleaning here at FMU. And nothing too crazy here, just going to go ahead and finish off the oil change on this Audi R8. This car has multiple oil plugs, so we're going to have to remove those and drain oil from several different places.
At Fluid MotorUnion, we're dedicated to keeping your Lamborghini V10 or Audi at peak performance while protecting its value. Our three-step process gives you better results than walnut shell blasting alone with no damage to your valve components. But it's not just the exotics that can benefit. We can give everybody an expert opinion on carbon cleaning for their luxury car's gasoline direct injection engine. So don't hesitate to contact us. If you're looking for reliable service for your Lamborghini Audi, you should trust Fluid MotorUnion to get it done right. Thanks for watching, and drive safe.